Mr. Chomsky, many people have a difficulty to imagine how a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia could look like. The problem is that now Russia annexed 4 regions in Ukraine, and I'm sure that Russia and Mr. Putin don't want to give them back to Ukraine. On the other hand, I'm sure that Ukraine doesn't want to give away those regions forever. So I and many people have a difficulty to imagine if peace talks took place, what a fair or a possible result of these negotiations might be. What are your ideas about that?
We don't get anywhere with peace negotiations if we first sketch out the long-term goal that we want and say, let's insist on that. Then the various sides have irreconcilable positions. The only way let me first mention that it is critically important that we move towards a diplomatic negotiated settlement. If we don't, the costs for Ukraine, for Russia, for millions of people starving around the world, for all of us who might face a terminal nuclear war, those costs are incalculable. So it's of critical importance that we make every effort to see if there is some way to move towards a peaceful diplomatic settlement. By definition, a diplomatic settlement does not give each side everything it wants, but it gives them enough so they can live with it. It's the least of unpleasant options. That's the nature of diplomacy. The alternative to diplomacy is to fight on till you destroy each other. Okay, that's a possibility. The other possibility is to move towards diplomacy. And the way to do it is to see if you can take first steps, small steps that may set up conditions under which further steps can be taken. And that's how diplomacy can work. If you say, here are 2 irreconcilable positions, it's hopeless. And there are steps. In fact, some have been taken under Turkish auspices, the steps towards opening up some, if not all, of the shipments of grain and fertilizer that much of the world desperately needs and that are produced in this region, in the Black Sea region. Well, that's a small step. You can take further steps of that kind. There are many that you can think of. For example, one thing that is very significant for Russia is relief of the sanctions. That is also of great significance for Europe. Western Europe is already suffering and is going to continue to decline unless a very natural relationship with Russia is reestablished. Russia is a tremendous source of raw materials, not just gas and oil, but titanium, other metals that are critical for the German-based European economy, a very sophisticated economic system based on Germany, stretching from the Netherlands to Slovakia, heavily dependent on interactions with Russia and with a market in China. And these things are connected. A map shows you why they're connected. So for Western Europe and for Russia, there is a significant interest in moving towards removing sanctions in return for steps in Ukraine that would lead towards a diplomatic settlement. Well, those are options that can be pursued. And you can think of proposals, in fact, proposals have been made that might be investigated, like for the conflicted Donbass region. Might be possible to move towards a sort of an international protectorate, a UN controlled region neutralized with moves towards determining whether you can perhaps reach something like the Minsk II agreements, which had assumed a relatively autonomous Donbass region inside a federated Ukraine. It's a goal that could be sought. Some moves must be made to prevent the ongoing attempt built up now to have a Ukrainian invasion of Crimea. That's going to be a bloodbath with consequences that are indescribable. If it succeeds, it'll be a bloodbath. If it doesn't succeed, Russia is likely to move to escalate to higher level of attack on Ukraine. Western Ukraine has been hit to some extent, but nothing like the shock and awe tactics that the US, Britain, and Israel constantly undertake, where they immediately go for the jugular, ensure that the country cannot function, destroy all infrastructure, energy, telecommunications, transportation. In fact, US and British military analysts have been somewhat surprised since the beginning that Russia did not do that. It's now beginning to do it, could do more of it, could get much worse. And you can easily see steps up the escalation ladder. If Russia could move to start attacking the supply lines that fund the Ukrainian military, or put them into conflict with Poland, we now have the steps towards ongoing, go up the further steps, you're in a terminal nuclear war. All of these things are potential. So preventing a war in Crimea is very essential. Again, you can imagine diplomatic moves. In fact, Zelensky suggested some of them as recently as last March. I'll just put it on the back burner. Let's deal with it later. It's a complicated issue. See if we can find out what the population of Crimea wants. There are all kinds of steps that can be made, small steps to improve the circumstances in which negotiations can take place. And there's strong support for them. I don't know about opinion in Russia. We don't have good information. But there have been, in Western Europe, the pressure for negotiations is quite strong. The German government is agreeing under plenty of pressure to send tanks, but the German population is not all that much in support of it. Public opinion polls in Germany have shown for some time strong majorities favoring moves towards a diplomatic settlement. Of course, in the rest of the world, the global South, calls for negotiation are just overwhelming. They don't want this war to go on. They don't want to participate in it. Don't take part in sanctions. Don't exclude Russia. Don't want to take part in what they see as a European war and want it ended for their own benefit and for the benefit. So there's plenty of, in fact, even in Ukraine, but we don't have a lot of information, but there have been international polls, Gallup polls, US-run polls, which we can assume plausibly to be fairly accurate. They're kind of interesting in what they show. They're not reported in the United States, but what they show, one part is reported that about 75% of the population of Ukraine is committed to pursuing the war. But there's another part of those same polls, which I haven't seen reported. It's been reported elsewhere. If you look at the regions where with the conflicted regions, the regions where fighting is imminent or going on, figures change. About almost half the population wants to move towards negotiations. Well, those are understandable, perfectly understandable opinions. Perhaps you can build on them, but you can't take a look at the irreconcilable positions and say it's hopeless. You can only hope to move towards it in small steps of accommodation and mutual recognition of the immense advantages that will accrue to all sides if a diplomatic settlement can be reached. And then we can only hope. There are somewhat fairly detailed proposals on paper. So if you take a look at the current issue of Le Monde Diplomatique, there's a proposal by two Finnish analysts spelling out a course of possible negotiations along essentially these lines. Well, you can't know if it's going to work if you don't try. That's for sure. The last effort we know of to make an attempt was last March. There were negotiations underway between Ukraine and Russia under Turkish auspices. It doesn't get reported much in the West, but Ukrainian press has reported it, and it's pretty credible. What they say is that the negotiations collapsed. They didn't succeed. We don't know why, but we do know that the United States and Britain informed the Ukrainian government that they were opposed to it. The US and Britain are the two most militant Western states. They're the traditional warrior states. Boris Johnson, who was then prime minister, flew to Ukraine, informed Ukrainian government the US and Britain didn't want it. He was followed by Lloyd Austin, the US Secretary of Defense, who presumably gave his usual message that, which is the official US position, that the war must continue in order to severely weaken Russia, not to save Ukraine, to severely weaken Russia. And therefore the US does not back negotiations at this time. Well, that position has somewhat softened since, but it still remains the official position. Ukraine will decide what it wants, but the US position and the British position have been detrimental to moves towards making some kind of negotiated arrangement. And Turkey has intervened. Saudi Arabia seems to be making some moves. There are other parts of the world that India might become involved. It's conceivable they all want the war to be ended and might be in a position to move around the reluctance of the two major warrior states, the US and Britain, to allow serious negotiations to proceed. We can only hope that that will happen. The alternatives are pretty awful to contemplate.
Mm-hmm. You just mentioned that those small steps of compromise and accommodation are possible, are thinkable, but in contrast to that, what we see are actually small steps of escalation. Last time we talked, Germany sent about 5,000 helmets to Ukraine and was mocked for this decision. Now, a few weeks ago, we're talking on February 1st, 23, Germany decided a few weeks ago to send tanks, 14 right now, Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. And at the same time, United States decided to send their own tanks. England decided to send tanks. Obviously, Poland for a long time wanted to support Ukraine with tanks. So how do you view this development of armament of Ukraine, especially having an already difficult situation for negotiations? And what do you say to arguments on the Ukrainian side that say, if you do not send weapons like tanks, then Ukraine will lose the war and Putin might annex all of Ukraine and kill even more people, especially keeping in mind that Ukrainians probably, as you mentioned yourself, 75% want to fight this war, would fight until the end. And this is, I think, a paradoxy. But on the one hand, you have those steps of escalation. But on the other hand, there is this argument, if we don't help them with good ammunition, they will fight with their hands and with their fists until maybe their ultimate end.
It's up to Ukrainians to decide what they want to do, not to me. What we can do is try to remove the impediments to a diplomatic settlement. It's not that, I mean, there are many in the mainstream establishment of the United States. You can read it in Foreign Affairs, the major establishment journal, who think that the United States should use its overwhelming influence in Ukraine to pressure Ukraine towards negotiations. That's one position. I'm suggesting a weaker position. Remove the impediments to negotiations. At least remove them and see if small steps can be taken. If not, if the issue is as you framed it, which is the way President Zelensky frames it, many Ukrainians do, either we'll win the war or we'll fight to the last man. Well, if that's Ukrainians' choice, can't do anything about it. But what we can do is try to eliminate the barriers to saving Ukraine and much of the world from a disaster. Remove the barriers to it, see if steps can be taken. If it's framed as either we get tanks and jet planes or we lose the war, then it's finished. You get tanks and jet planes, the war is going to escalate, Ukraine will be destroyed with consequences well beyond. Ukraine has already suffered pretty severely. Not on the scale of the victims of US-British attacks, like according to Ukrainian sources, about 10,000 civilians have been killed. That's pretty ugly, but let's put it in perspective. Take one of the small wars of the West, Israel's invasion of Lebanon, small war sponsored by the US. 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinian civilians were killed, twice the number in Ukraine. If you look at a real US war, like the war in Serbia, Iraq, certainly Vietnam, I mean, you're talking about millions of civilians being killed. So a lot more could happen, much worse. And we certainly don't want that. Nobody wants that, including Ukrainians. So we have to ask, can we smooth the way towards a diplomatic settlement which will avoid the local horrors for Ukraine and Russia and the broader ones from the rest of the world, broader effects on the rest of the world, which are severe. I mean, there are millions of people facing starvation because they're losing the grain and fertilizer from this region. There's another, and there is the possible move up the escalation ladder, in which case we're all done, finished for all of us. There's another problem that's barely being discussed. One of the effects of the war in Ukraine is to reverse the limited efforts to deal with the existential crisis of climate destruction. Just this morning, for example, you can read that in the press that the Biden administration is opening up vast new areas of oil exploration in Alaska. They're planning, it's 30 years more of fossil fuel production on a vast scale. And the pretext for it is we have to provide fossil fuels to compensate for the loss of Russian fuels in Western Europe. I mean, I think that's more of a pretext than a reason. They just want to make money. But here's a pretext that, and it's happening all over. Germany has constructed its first major LNG, liquefied natural gas terminal. All of these are steps backwards when we must be devoting resources to sustainable energy and must be ending the use of fossil fuels. If not, we're finished. We're destroying the climate at a rate that cannot be sustained. If you take a look at the actual projections, they're shocking. Take the Eastern Mediterranean, the region where most of the fossil fuels are being produced. Israeli scientists who are quite good, and international scientists, have predicted that by the end of the century, not very far, the lifetime of people being born now, by the end of the century, temperatures in the Eastern Mediterranean will have risen 5 degrees Celsius, and the sea level will have risen 2 to 2.5 meters. Take a look at the Eastern Mediterranean. Where are people settled? The whole mass population is along the seacoast. What happens? In fact, much of these areas are barely livable today. South Asia, same thing. We're at the edge of total catastrophe and wasting resources and destruction now when they must be used for sustainable energy is a crime on a cosmic scale. You might not see it tomorrow, but you're going to see it in a generation. We know what's coming. All of this has been set into reverse by the war and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. These are very broad issues. Now, if you look at it from another point of view, from the US point of view, it's a wonderful gain. US is gaining enormously from the war in Ukraine. Europe is suffering, but not the United States. For the US corporate sector, it's a boondoggle. Stock prices for Lockheed Martin, other war producers, are booming. In the offices of fossil fuel producers, the banks that fund them, is total euphoria, doing wonderfully. In the Pentagon, they love it. I mean, at a small percentage of the US defense budget, military budget, the US degrading severely the military forces of its main military opponent. I mean, it's a bargain. In fact, they can't get over it. They're talking about it all over the place. Lots of articles talking about what a great bargain this is for the United States. Huge economic bargain, destroying the main enemy at small expense, driving Europe into Washington's pocket. Remember, there's been a struggle going back to the end of the Second World War, nothing new, about whether Europe will become an independent force in world affairs or whether it'll just be a subordinate of the United States. The US, of course, has wanted the latter. This goes back to early 50s when France proposed a European, what they called a European defense community that would be independent of Washington. That Washington wanted the NATO system, which the US runs and which Europe follows US orders. And that's been a battle all the way through the Cold War. The end of the Cold War became very clear with Mikhail Gorbachev's proposals for what he called a common European home from Lisbon to Vladivostok, no military alliances, independent. The US, of course, is strongly opposed to this. And now Russia, in its criminal stupidity, along with a criminal aggression, has given the United States its fondest wish on a silver platter, Europe subordinate to the United States. So from the US point of view, couldn't imagine anything better. And those are pressures that maintain the policy of fighting the war to weaken Russia even further, establish greater US global domination. The rest of the world doesn't want this. It's preferring a move towards what's called multipolarity, different centers of power. You take a look at India, Indonesia, they're not part, or Africa, they're not part of this. They don't take part in sanctions. They welcome Russian visitors and trade arrangements. They just don't want to take part in this war. But for the US, it's been an enormous boon. It's totally destructive for the world for the reasons I've mentioned, environment, potential dangers, but those are not concerns for planners in corporate offices or in governments.
You spoke about the total catastrophe with regards to climate change, and you also mentioned the possibility of atomic weapons at the very beginning of this interview. I am slightly worried, and I'm not alone, that the escalation of war that's happening right now by Europe and US sending more tanks that will certainly not make Vladimir Putin happier, that this could lead to some defeats of Russia, and then the big Russian bear could be really angry using tactical atomic weapons. And some propagandists in Russia are already making sarcastic jokes that we Russians have been in Berlin once, we can easily return a second time. And my penultimate question to you, Mr. Chomsky, is a very difficult one, but it's on almost everybody's mind. That's why I wanted to ask that. It's the danger of an atomic war. How do you evaluate this with regards to the sending of tanks and potentially jets towards Ukraine? Or is this something that Putin bluffs with because he knows that US themselves have tactical weapons? France and Britain has themselves tactical weapons, and they would counter attack if Russia decided to do so. So is it a real threat, or just like in a Cold War, a big potential threat that will not be actually exercised by the presidents of the respective countries?
If you look over the history of the Cold War, we came ominously close to terminal nuclear war repeatedly. Not because anyone planned it, just it's too easy to happen. It can go through. I mean, there's one couple of famous cases. One famous case is during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy imposed, in effect, a blockade, an illegal blockade around Cuba. And there were Russian submarines there. Submarines that were not designed for tropical regions. They were designed for northern regions. They were under the submarine. The conditions in the submarines were indescribable. They could barely survive. Well, at one point, Russian submarines were attacked by US destroyers with weapons to try to drive them out of the area. Commanders of the Russians didn't know what was of the submarines didn't know what was happening. They'd lost contact with Moscow. All they knew is death bombs are being dropped near them. They assumed we're probably at war. The commanders thought we might as well send off our nuclear-tipped torpedoes. If they had done so, we wouldn't be here. That would have led to a response which would have escalated to total war. Well, in the main submarine, the Russian protocol is that two officers, high-level officers, have to approve the commander's decision to send off the missiles. One of them refused, Vasily Akhapov. That's why we're talking to each other. Okay. There was another case under Reagan, when Reagan was carrying out simulated nuclear attacks on Russia. The Reagan administration assumed the Russians would understand that this is just simulated. Well, at one point, one of a Russian officer got information from the automated systems that there was a US missile attack on Russia. What he was supposed to do was inform the high command, who would then presumably retaliate. He just decided not to. He decided it didn't look like a real attack. There weren't enough missiles and didn't see any reason for it, so he just didn't send the information. That's why we're here. There have been many cases like that. So to say nobody wants terminal war is not an answer. There's just too many ways it can happen. In this case, the dangers are not insignificant. Nobody sane wants to take a gamble as to whether it'll happen or not. That's insanity, okay? And put yourself in the position of some Russian military official. He sees German tanks, advanced German tanks, sent to Ukraine with an open planes leading right on to Moscow and St. Petersburg. German tanks evoke some memories. Does it? Okay, how do we know how they'll react? Suppose it goes on to jet planes, even worse. We don't know how they'll react, but we can imagine the way the United States would react. US would react by simply wiping out Ukraine. If Mexico had advanced Chinese weapons aimed at the United States, and Mexico hasn't invaded and destroyed the United States a couple of times in the last century, if Mexico dared to do that, there wouldn't be any Mexico anymore.
And then the end of our interview, I know your time is limited, Mr. Chomsky. I would like to ask you a slightly lighter question. I am myself am an argumentation trainer, so I'm really interested in rational arguments. And since you are an internationally known critical thinker and obviously a great arguer, is there maybe an argument or a point of view, a standpoint that you held in the past, but where you changed your perspective completely, 180 degrees, because there was a new argument put forward in a real discussion or in a book or in a newspaper, wherever, where you really read this argument and were suddenly convinced? Excuse me. Is there some example of an argument that convinced you in the latest couple of years where you changed your mind completely? And what rational argument was that?
Well, over the years, I've certainly learned a lot, but maybe I'm too conservative, but I can't say that I've really changed my point of view much since I was a young teenager. Actually, the first article I wrote back in 1939, can date it easily. It was about the fall of Barcelona to Franco, so February 1939. And it was about the threat of the spread of fascism around the world. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Toledo, main city in Spain, Barcelona. It looked as if it was going on indefinitely. Sure, it wasn't a very smart article for an elementary school newspaper, but it's pretty much the way I looked at the world then. I still look at it pretty much that way. I also, obviously I've changed my mind about a lot of things. A lot has been learned. I did not know in 1950 that the United States there was a huge move towards rearmament, massive rearmament program. I was unaware at the time that a lot of this was being taken for economic reasons. It looked as if it was presented as defensive regions, which looked plausible, China, Russia, and so on. Turns out now we know that that's not true. A lot of it was done for domestic and international reasons, a lot of them having to do with what we were just discussing, ensuring that Europe would remain within the US domains and not move towards neutrality or even towards the East. I was not aware of those things at the time. Now we are, or should be. But in fundamental ways, I can't really say I've changed my views very much, including social and political.
I see. And is there some kind of a political utopia or like a compelling future that you see for the next century? I mean, I researched that right now, correct me if I'm wrong, you're 94. So you were born in the late 20s. You have seen the Second World War. You were part of economic crises. I assume that you're a realist and you won't say that there will be eternal peace forever. Like, for instance, Immanuel Kant proposed it in one of his articles that is called Zum ewigen Frieden, so about eternal peace. But can you paint us, just so the interview doesn't end in a grim way, a compelling or positive utopia that we might enter in the middle or in the end of the 21st century? Or are you rather realistic and you say people will always fight, there will always be imbalances, US will always be trying to control Europe, while China or other mighty powers will try to counterstand to the United States? Or is there a utopia and eternal peace Immanuel Kant was talking about, in your head at least?
Well, as I said before, I'm interested in incremental steps towards a goal that we may have in mind. The goal may be eternal peace. Question is, what steps can we take towards it that are feasible? And there are feasible steps. Let's go back to 1991. Russia collapsed. Mikhail Gorbachev put forward his proposals for a common European home, including Eurasia, which would, in his view, move towards some kind of internal social democratic policies with no military alliances. This was quite feasible. In fact, there were steps towards that in Europe through the Cold War. De Gaulle's moved towards independent Europe from, in his view, Atlantic to the Urals. Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik moves towards accommodations with the East. The proposals by Olof Palme and others, not unreasonable. In Ukraine, the Minsk II proposals could have been a step towards settlement, prevention of major crimes. All of these things are more or less in hand. They're not utopia, far from it, but they're steps towards that can lead to a basis for moving on to a far better world. We should take those steps.
Professor Chomsky, very big thanks for this second wonderful interview. And dear YouTuber, I hope you liked this interview. And this was my second interview with Professor Chomsky. The first one you will find if you click on the link in the description below. And to see the other side of the coin, the American perspective, I also have done an interview with the commanding general of the US Army in Europe, Ben Hodges. You will also find this interview if you click in the description below, because for me and for this channel, it's really important to see the two sides of the coin. I'm looking forward to your comments, and subscribe for more insightful and interesting interviews to this channel. I hope to see you soon. Goodbye. This was Wlad.